My neighbor takes up all the parking spaces on the street, so I got revenge by making friends with the birds. It started simply enough. Garrett owned 3 luxury cars, a Porsche, a Range Rover, and some vintage Mustang. Every morning at 6 a.m., he'd shuffle them around, positioning them to take up maximum space. 4 spots for 3 cars, strategic gaps nobody could fit into. I tried talking to him once. I work nights at the hospital, I explained. When I come home at 3 a.m., there's nowhere to park. He looked at me over his designer sunglasses. Not my problem. For 6 months, I parked 3 blocks away and walked home exhausted after 12-hour shifts. Other neighbors complained too. The elderly couple next door, the single mom with twins. Garrett would just point to the public street sign, first come, first served. Then I noticed the crows. They gathered on his cars every morning, leaving white streaks across the pristine paint. Garrett would rage, chasing them with a broom, washing his cars obsessively. The birds always returned. That's when I got the idea. I started with peanuts, unsalted, in the shell. Every morning before my shift, I'd scatter them on my balcony. The crows came immediately, intelligent creatures who recognize patterns and faces. Within a week, they knew me. I began training them. First, I moved the feeding spot to the tree directly above Garrett's parking area. Then I adjusted the timing, feeding them right when he usually moved his cars. The crows learned to wait, perched and ready. By month 2, I introduced bread soaked in fish oil. The smell attracted not just crows, but seagulls, pigeons, even wild turkeys. The bird population exploded. The transformation of Garrett's cars was remarkable. His black Porsche became a Jackson Pollock painting of bird droppings. The Range Rover's roof looked like it had been through a blizzard. The Mustang, his baby, suffered worst. Garrett installed motion-activated sprinklers. The birds learned to trigger them for fun. He bought ultrasonic deterrents. I countered with sweat cakes. He hung reflective tape. The crows stole it for their nests. 3 months in, I befriended the ravens. Ravens are different, larger, smarter, and they hold grudges. I fed them separately with expensive raw meat. They learned to recognize Garrett's car keys by sound. When he'd jingle them, they'd mob him. The war escalated. Garrett started waking at 5 a.m. to beat the birds. I adjusted my feeding schedule. He covered his cars with tarps. The ravens learned to pull them off in coordinated teams. The breaking point came Tuesday. I found a note on my door. I know it's you. Stop or I'll make you stop. That night, glass shattered. My windshield spiderwebbed from a brick. Our building's camera had been spray painted that evening. I didn't call police. Instead, I called my cousin who worked at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. How do you feel about corvids? I asked. They're brilliant. Why? I need to borrow something special. He brought 3 rescued ravens, imprinted on humans but unreleasable. They needed daily care and someone with medical training. Perfect. These weren't ordinary ravens. They'd been trained for an education program before funding cuts. They knew commands, could retrieve objects, could even mimic sounds, including car alarms. The next morning, I introduced them to the flock with Garrett's Porsche alarm playing on repeat. Within hours, they'd learned it perfectly. At 2 a.m., the symphony began. 17 ravens, perched on different trees, recreating his car alarm in perfect unison, every 15 minutes, like clockwork. Garrett would stumble outside, key fob in hand, pressing buttons frantically. The moment he went inside, they'd start again. By day 3, he was haggard. By day 5, he'd called the police twice. They couldn't cite birds for noise violations. That's when I noticed him packing boxes into his Range Rover. Then yesterday, a for sale sign appeared on his lawn. This morning, all 3 cars were gone. Finally, parking spaces. But at noon, a moving truck arrived. Not for Garrett, for the house next door. The elderly couple was leaving too. Then I saw who was directing the movers, Garrett's brother. And behind him, 2 more Range Rovers pulling up. I couldn't fit what happens next in this short video, watch the rest down below. The brother looked exactly like Garrett, only bigger, meaner. He wore the same designer sunglasses, the same smug expression. Behind him stood 2 other men, cousins maybe, or business partners. They surveyed the street like generals planning a conquest. Within an hour, they'd claimed every available parking spot. Not just Garrett's old spaces. Every single one on both sides of the street. 6 vehicles total. 3 Range Rovers, a Bentley, a Tesla, and something Italian I couldn't identify. They parked with military precision, maximizing territory. I watched from my window as the brother, I'd later learn his name was Crawford, approached my elderly neighbors. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds. The old man's shoulders sagged. His wife started crying. That evening, I found a note under my windshield wiper. We know what you did to Garrett. Try your bird tricks with us. See what happens. The Pemberton family. The Pembertons. Of course. I should have known Garrett wasn't just some random entitled neighbor. The Pembertons owned half the city. Construction companies, restaurants, a waste management business that definitely wasn't just about garbage collection. My cousin called that night. Those ravens I lent you? I need them back. Wildlife Services got a complaint. Someone claiming dangerous birds are attacking residents. I knew it was Crawford. He'd called in favors, pulled strings. Within 24 hours, my feathered allies were gone. But Crawford underestimated me, and he definitely underestimated the crows. Ravens might be smarter, but crows are loyal. The local murder, that's what you call a group of crows, had been feeding off my generosity for months. They knew me. They trusted me. And unlike the rehabilitated ravens, they were completely wild, untouchable. Crawford's first mistake was thinking this was about parking. It wasn't. It had never been about parking. It was about respect, about bullies thinking they could push people around because they had money and connections. I started small again, different approach this time. Crawford's crew followed a routine. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., they'd move their vehicles in a coordinated shuffle, like some bizarre automotive ballet. They'd created a system that let them monopolize 14 parking spaces with 6 cars, but routines create vulnerabilities. I began studying them. Crawford himself drove the lead Range Rover, license plate PMBR1. Behind him, his Lieutenant Donovan handled the Bentley. A thin man named Quinton managed the Tesla. The others followed predetermined patterns. They were organized, professional even, but they weren't creative. I started leaving different treats around their cars. Not for the birds, for observation. Every morning, I'd place specific items: a red bottle cap by the Range Rover, a yellow pen by the Bentley, blue ribbon on the Tesla's antenna. Within a week, I knew exactly which car went where and when. The crows noticed too. They're curious creatures, attracted to shiny objects. Soon they were collecting my markers, bringing them to their roosts. I followed them, mapping their territory. 3 blocks north, they'd claimed an abandoned warehouse. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And at the center of their communal area, they'd built something remarkable: a shrine, made entirely of stolen items. Bottle caps, jewelry, coins, cell phone cases, car emblems. Years of accumulated treasures, arranged in complex patterns only they understood. That's when I realized the crows weren't just smart. They were organized. I began leaving specific items near Crawford's cars. Always the same brand of bottle cap, same color ribbon, same style of pen. The crows collected them religiously, adding them to their shrine. But I was teaching them something else: association. Crawford's crew thought they were dealing with random bird behavior. They'd installed more deterrents: spike strips, owl decoys, ultrasonic devices. The crows ignored them all, because I was feeding them away from the cars now, in the park, at the warehouse, creating positive reinforcement separate from their target area. Classical conditioning with a twist. Every day at 7 a.m., I'd play the same sound from my apartment window, a specific frequency that attracted corvids. The crows would gather, expecting food, but I'd only feed them after Crawford's crew finished their morning shuffle. I was training them to associate Crawford's cars with anticipation, hunger, need. 3 weeks later, I escalated. Instead of bottle caps and ribbons, I started leaving food near their vehicles. Not much, just enough to establish the pattern. The crows learned that Crawford's morning routine meant breakfast was coming, but I controlled when breakfast actually arrived. I'd wait until Crawford and his crew were inside, then whistle from my window. The crows would descend, not for food near the cars, but to search. They'd perch on mirrors, peck at windows, investigate every surface. Crawford emerged one morning to find 40 crows treating his Range Rover like a jungle gym. He tried hosing them off. They scattered, then returned. He installed motion sprinklers. The crows learned to trigger them, then dance in the spray. He called animal control. They explained that crows are protected under federal law. No permits for lethal control, no relocation options. Learn to coexist, the officer suggested. Crawford's face turned purple. But the real breakthrough came by accident. One of my elderly neighbors, the ones Crawford had intimidated, dropped her grocery bag near his Bentley. Apples scattered everywhere. The crows swarmed, fighting over the fruit. Donovan emerged, screaming, swinging his briefcase at the birds. He connected with one of them, a juvenile, maybe 6 months old. The crow hit the pavement hard, wing bent at an unnatural angle. The other crows went silent. Then one began to call, a harsh, urgent cry that echoed through the neighborhood. Within minutes, crows were arriving from every direction. Dozens, then hundreds. They formed a circle around the injured bird, and around Donovan. He backed toward his car, briefcase raised defensively. The crows didn't attack. They just watched, waited. Silent now, except for the steady clicking of beaks. I'd read about this behavior. Crow courts. When one of their own is threatened, they gather to pass judgment. The injured bird tried to stand, failed, collapsed again. An older crow, probably the juvenile's parent, approached Donovan's car. It hopped onto the hood, fixed him with one black eye, and began the most haunting sound I'd ever heard. A keening wail, mourning, accusation, promise. Donovan fled inside his car, locked the doors, started the engine. The crows parted just enough to let him escape, but dozens followed his Bentley down the street, cawing at every turn. I rushed outside, gathered the injured crow carefully in a towel, and drove straight to my cousin at the wildlife center. Fractured wing, he said after examining the bird. Clean break. Should heal fine with proper care. How long? 6 weeks. Maybe 8. I named him Fletcher. For the next 2 months, I visited every other day, brought him treats, talked to him while he recovered. Ravens might be smarter, but crows remember faces, and they remember who helps. When Fletcher was released, the entire murder was waiting. They surrounded him, preening his feathers, touching beaks in what looked like celebration. Then, as a group, they turned toward downtown, toward Crawford Street. What happened next was unlike anything in the ornithology journals. The crows began targeting Donovan specifically. Not his car, not his property. Him. They'd wait on power lines, watching his apartment building. When he emerged, they'd follow. Not attacking, just present. A living shadow of judgment. At traffic lights, they'd land on his windshield. In parking lots, they'd surround his car in perfect formation. At outdoor restaurants, they'd perch on nearby tables, watching him eat. Donovan started carrying an umbrella everywhere. The crows ignored it, staying just out of range, but always visible. Within 2 weeks, he looked haggard, paranoid. He'd installed cameras around his car, paid for covered parking, even hired a bodyguard. The crows adapted to everything. Crawford tried to help, hired exterminators who explained they couldn't kill protected birds, consulted with wildlife management specialists who suggested relocating. "Where exactly do you relocate an entire urban crow population?" one expert asked. "And what makes you think they wouldn't just come back?" The answer, of course, was nothing. Crows have territories spanning miles. They communicate across vast networks, and they never forget. But I was just getting started. Crawford's operation depended on routine. His crew arrived at the same time, parked in the same pattern, left for work at the same hour. Their coordination was their strength. It was also their weakness. I began introducing chaos into their system. Small things at first. A traffic cone placed strategically, forcing them to adjust their parking formation. A temporary construction sign that lasted exactly as long as their morning shuffle. Pothole repairs that blocked one space for 24 hours. Each disruption was minor, explainable, temporary, but they accumulated. Crawford's crew started arriving earlier, trying to beat whatever obstacle might appear. I adjusted my tactics accordingly. If they showed up at 6:30, the disruption appeared at 6:15. The stress began showing. Quentin snapped at Donovan over a parking space. Crawford yelled at both of them. Their careful coordination started breaking down into arguments and finger-pointing. Meanwhile, the crows escalated their psychological warfare. They'd learned Donovan's schedule perfectly. Work, gym, grocery store, home. At every location, they'd be waiting. Not threatening, just there, watching, remembering. Other birds joined them. Seagulls from the harbor, pigeons from downtown, even occasional hawks drawn by the unusual gathering. The local news picked up the story. Man claims birds are following him. Coincidence or Corvid conspiracy? The reporter interviewed Donovan outside his office building. Behind him, perched on every available surface, dozens of crows watched silently. When the reporter asked about the bird behavior, they all cocked their heads in unison. The footage went viral. Crow Court started trending. People began sharing their own stories of crow intelligence, crow memory, crow justice. The comment section filled with ornithology facts and theories about corvid communication. "They're organizing," wrote one wildlife biologist. "This level of coordination suggests information sharing across multiple family groups." A documentary filmmaker reached out to Donovan, offering to follow his story. He declined, but the filmmaker started interviewing neighbors instead, including me. "Have you noticed any unusual bird behavior?" she asked, camera rolling. I feigned ignorance. "I mean, there are definitely more crows around lately, but I work nights, so I'm not out much during the day." She pressed for details about the parking situation, the Pemberton family, the escalating tension in the neighborhood. I kept my answers vague, sympathetic, but uninformed. But privately, I was documenting everything. Photos of the crow gatherings, videos of their coordinated movements, audio recordings of their varied calls. What I discovered was remarkable. The crows weren't just following Donovan randomly. They were taking shifts. Family groups would rotate surveillance duty, ensuring he was never without watchers but not exhausting any single group. They'd developed a communication system, specific calls that meant target spotted, target moving, all clear. Other bird species had learned to interpret these calls, joining the surveillance network. They were building an intelligence apparatus that would make the CIA jealous, and they were having fun with it. Crawford's crew installed a new deterrent system, motion-activated air horns that would blast whenever birds approached their cars. The crows figured out how to trigger them from a safe distance, creating a neighborhood noise ordinance violation. When Crawford tried to disable the horns, the crows had learned to trigger them in sequence, creating percussive rhythms that attracted even more birds. The homeowners association called an emergency meeting. I attended, along with most of the block. Crawford sat in the front row with his remaining crew. Donovan had moved to a different neighborhood, claiming health reasons. The HOA president, a stern woman named Bethany, called for order. "We need to address the bird situation," she began. "The noise, the mess, the general disruption to our community." Crawford stood immediately. "This is targeted harassment," he declared. "Someone is training these birds to attack specific residents. It's illegal, it's dangerous, and it needs to stop." He pointed directly at me. "That woman has been involved from the beginning. She lived next to my brother. She has access to the birds. She's the only one who hasn't been bothered by them." A murmur went through the room. Heads turned toward me. I stood slowly, projecting the exhausted calm of someone who worked night shifts at a hospital. "I'm sorry," I said. "Are you accusing me of what exactly? Training wild birds to follow your friend around? That's not how wildlife works." Crawford's face reddened. "You're a nurse. You have connections to veterinarians. I could easily what?" I interrupted. "Teach crows to hold grudges? They already do that. Teach them to remember faces. That's natural behavior. Teach them to communicate with each other. They've been doing that for millions of years." I looked around the room. "Has anyone else been followed by these birds? Harassed? Threatened?" Silence. "Because from what I've observed, they seem focused on one person, someone who injured one of them. Crows are known to retaliate when their young are threatened." Bethany checked her notes. "There was a report of an injured bird near Mr. Donovan's car. Animal control confirmed it was treated and released." Crawford jumped up. "That was an accident. He was defending himself." "From what?" asked the elderly man Crawford had intimidated months earlier. From birds looking for food? My wife drops groceries sometimes. The birds clean it up. We don't swing briefcases at them. The room's mood shifted. Crawford realized he'd lost the narrative. Look, he said, trying a different approach. This isn't about guilt or innocence. We have a practical problem. These birds are disrupting property values, creating safety hazards, making the neighborhood unlivable. For who? Asked the single mom with twins. My kids love watching them. They're better behaved than most of our neighbors. Laughter rippled through the room. Crawford tried again. The parking situation alone. What parking situation? Interrupted another neighbor. For the first time in years, we can all find spaces. You and your brother were the ones hogging them. The meeting devolved into neighbors airing grievances about the Pemberton family's behavior. The aggressive parking, the intimidation tactics, the entitled attitudes. Bethany called for order again. The HOA has no authority over wildlife, she announced. If you have concerns about illegal animal training, contact the appropriate authorities. Otherwise, I suggest we all learn to coexist with our local fauna. Crawford stormed out, but not before fixing me with a look that promised retaliation. I wasn't worried. The Crows had taught me something important about patience, persistence, and community organization. But Crawford had resources I didn't expect. 2 days later, my car was vandalized. Not a brick through the windshield this time. Something more sophisticated. Sugar in the gas tank. Slashed tires. Paint stripper on the hood. I called the police. They took a report, asked if I had any enemies, suggested I install security cameras. I knew it was Crawford, but proving it would be nearly impossible. That night, I noticed unusual crow behavior. They were agitated, calling constantly, flying in tight circles around the block. It reminded me of their response to Fletcher's injury. Urgent, organized, purposeful. By morning, I understood why. Crawford's remaining vehicles were covered in something that wasn't bird droppings. It was thick, brown, and it smelled like death. I approached carefully, covering my nose. The substance had been applied systematically, coating every surface. Windows, door handles, tires, even the undersides of the cars. It took me a moment to identify the smell. Fish. Rotten fish. Fermented to the point of liquid putrefaction. The crows watched from nearby trees, occasionally cawing what sounded like satisfaction. Crawford emerged from his house wearing a hazmat mask, carrying a pressure washer. The moment he turned it on, the smell intensified. Hot water mixed with rotting fish created a miasma that cleared the block. Neighbors emerged from their houses, gagging, complaining, demanding explanations. Crawford tried to clean his cars, but the fish oil had been mixed with something else, something that made it stick like automotive paint. The pressure washer just spread it around. He called a detailing service. They took one look, one smell, and drove away. Professional hazmat cleaners wanted $2,000 per vehicle. By afternoon, Crawford had moved all his cars to a different location. The smell lingered on the street for 3 days, making the entire block nearly uninhabitable. On day 4, an envelope appeared under my door. You've made your point. We'll find somewhere else to park. Call off your birds. It wasn't signed, but I recognized Crawford's handwriting from his previous threat. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The Crows had sent their own message, and it was crystal clear. But Crawford's departure created an unexpected problem. Without a common enemy, the Crow population I'd attracted began looking for other sources of entertainment. They'd grown accustomed to regular feeding, daily excitement, constant stimulation. Now they were bored. And bored crows are destructive crows. They started investigating other neighbors, not maliciously, but with the same intensive curiosity they'd focused on Donovan and Crawford. Mrs. Kowalski, 3 houses down, found them rearranging her garden decorations into complex geometric patterns. The newlyweds at the corner discovered their outdoor wedding preparations had been redesigned according to Corvid aesthetics, all the white flowers relocated to form crow-friendly perches. Most concerning, they'd begun testing their problem-solving skills on mailboxes, garbage cans, and car locks. I realized I'd created a monster. A highly intelligent, socially organized, increasingly innovative monster with nothing productive to do. My cousin at the Wildlife Center wasn't surprised. You've been providing intellectual stimulation for months, he explained. Crows need mental challenges. Without them, they create their own entertainment. What kind of entertainment? Breaking into houses, stealing shiny objects, teaching their young advanced mischief techniques. There's a murder in Seattle that learned to activate automatic doors at grocery stores. They go shopping now. I had visions of my neighborhood crows developing opposable thumbs and forming a criminal syndicate. How do I redirect their energy constructively? You need to give them a job. A job. I thought about that for days, watching the crows experiment with increasingly complex pranks. They'd learned to untie shoelaces while people were walking. They could pickpocket loose items from jacket pockets. 3 of them working together could operate a car window that had been left cracked open. They were becoming too smart for their own good. That's when I remembered the documentary filmmaker who'd interviewed neighbors about the Pemberton situation. She'd mentioned wanting to study corvid intelligence, looking for funding to produce a series about urban wildlife adaptation. I reached out to her with a proposal. What if we created the first citizen science project focused on crow behavior modification? Not exploitation, but collaboration, giving the crows intellectual challenges while documenting their problem-solving abilities. She was intrigued. What did you have in mind? Puzzle feeders, logic problems, cooperative tasks that require multiple birds working together. We document everything, share the data with research institutions, maybe even develop new enrichment techniques for urban wildlife management. Within a week, we had a plan. The filmmaker would provide equipment and documentation. I'd design the challenges based on my months of observation. The neighborhood would become a living laboratory for human-corvid cooperation. We started with simple puzzle feeders, devices that required specific sequences of actions to access food. Push button A, pull lever B, lift door C, retrieve reward. The crows mastered them in hours. We escalated to multi-step problems requiring tool use. The crows not only solved them, but began modifying the tools, creating more efficient solutions. We introduced cooperative puzzles that needed multiple birds working simultaneously. They developed communication protocols, designated roles, even established hierarchies for complex tasks. The footage was incredible. The data was groundbreaking. But the real breakthrough came when we presented them with their greatest challenge yet. A locked box containing their favorite treats, secured with a combination lock. We assumed they'd ignore it, focus on easier targets. Instead, they watched us demonstrate the combination, memorized the sequence, and within 24 hours, they'd taught 3 other crows how to operate the lock. The documentary aired 9 months later on National Geographic. The Crow Wars, Intelligence, Cooperation, and Urban Wildlife Adaptation, became one of their highest-rated programs. It sparked follow-up studies at universities across the country. The footage of crows operating combination locks became required viewing in animal cognition courses. The neighborhood became famous in ornithology circles. Researchers visited regularly, adding new challenges, studying social learning patterns, documenting innovations. The crows thrived under the attention. They began performing for cameras, showing off their problem-solving skills, even developing what appeared to be aesthetic preferences in their tool modifications. But the most satisfying outcome was personal. 6 months after the documentary aired, I received a letter from Donovan, the man who'd injured Fletcher. He'd seen the program, recognized the neighborhood, the birds, the story behind their behavior. "I understand now why they followed me," he wrote. "I hurt one of their own, and they never forgot. I never apologized. To the birds, to the neighborhood, to you. I'm sorry. It won't bring back the bird I injured, but I wanted you to know that I learned something about consequences and respect." He'd included a donation to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where Fletcher had been treated. I never responded to his letter, but I shared it with the crows during one of our feeding sessions. They listened intently, heads cocked, as if weighing his words against their memories. Then Fletcher, now fully healed and one of the flock's leaders, let out a single sharp caw. The others took up the call, passing it through the murder until every crow in the neighborhood was calling. It sounded like forgiveness. The parking spaces remained open. The neighborhood stayed peaceful. The crows continued their research participation, developing increasingly sophisticated cognitive abilities, and Crawford never returned. But his story wasn't over. 3 years later, I received an unexpected visitor at the hospital where I worked. A well-dressed woman in her 50s, carrying legal documents. "I'm Patricia Pemberton," she said, "Crawford's mother. I believe we need to talk." She explained that Crawford had been arrested for harassment and property destruction in another state. Similar pattern, parking disputes, intimidation tactics, escalating retaliation against neighbors who complained. But this time, his victims had security cameras. "He's facing criminal charges," she continued, "multiple civil suits. His business partnerships are dissolving. Our family name is becoming toxic." She paused, studying my face. "Crawford told me what happened here, his version anyway. But I've done my own research. Talked to neighbors, watched your documentary, consulted with animal behaviorists." I waited. "My son isn't a bad person, but he was raised to believe that money and connections make you untouchable, that other people's needs don't matter if they interfere with your wants." She pulled out a check. "This is for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center where you volunteer. It's also an apology for my son's behavior. Crawford needs to learn that actions have consequences, regardless of family wealth." The check was for $50,000. "There's one more thing," she added. "Crawford wants to make amends. Not for legal reasons, but because watching your documentary made him realize what he'd become. He's asked if he can volunteer at the Wildlife Center, learn about the birds he spent so long fighting." I considered her offer. Crawford volunteering at the Wildlife Center would put him in direct contact with the crow's advocates, the researchers who documented his harassment, the community he'd tried to intimidate. It would be humbling, educational, possibly transformative. "He can apply like anyone else," I finally said, "but he'll need to start at the bottom. Cleaning cages, preparing food, learning basic animal care. No special treatment because of family connections." Patricia smiled. I wouldn't want it any other way. 6 months later, Crawford began his volunteer shifts. He worked quietly, followed instructions, asked thoughtful questions about corvid behavior and urban wildlife management. The crows recognized him immediately. They watched him work, heads tilted, debating among themselves in low caws and clicks. But they didn't harass him. They seemed curious about his presence, his change in behavior, his obvious discomfort around the birds he'd once tried to eliminate. One afternoon, Fletcher landed on the fence near Crawford's work area. Crawford froze, remembering their last encounter, his brother's smashed windshield, the circle of judgment, the months of surveillance that followed. Fletcher hopped closer, studying Crawford with one bright black eye. Then he dropped something at Crawford's feet, a bottle cap, red plastic, slightly faded. the same type of bottle cap I'd used during my original training sessions years earlier. Crawford looked confused until Fletcher picked up the cap and carried it to the feeding station, demonstrating the connection between objects and outcomes, cause and effect, respect and reward. He was teaching Crawford the same lessons I'd taught the crows. That cooperation produces better results than conflict. That intelligence without wisdom leads to destruction. That communities function best when everyone's needs are considered. Crawford began bringing his own offerings to the birds. Not food, but enrichment items. Puzzle toys, building materials for nests, interesting objects for their collection displays. The crows accepted his gifts cautiously at first, then with growing enthusiasm as they realized his intentions had changed. A year later, Crawford approached me at the Wildlife Center's annual fundraising gala. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "For what?" "For teaching me something my family's money never could. That respect can't be bought or taken. It has to be earned." He gestured toward the crowd, where several of our research crows were performing cognitive demonstrations for donors. "Fletcher is incredible. Watching him solve problems, communicate with his family, show empathy for injured birds. It's humbling. I spent months trying to destroy something I didn't understand." I nodded. "Crows forgive, but they don't forget. You'll always be the person who threatened their community, but you're also becoming the person who learned from that mistake." Crawford smiled sadly. Maybe that's enough. The evening ended with Fletcher perched on Crawford's shoulder, both of them watching the sunset through the center's large windows. The other crows had accepted this unlikely partnership, recognizing genuine change when they saw it. It wasn't a complete transformation. Crawford still struggled with entitlement, still occasionally expected special treatment. But the crows kept him honest, calling out inconsistencies in his behavior with the same intelligence they'd once used for retaliation. They'd become his accountability partners. The neighborhood remained peaceful. The parking spaces stayed available. The documentary sparked similar citizen science projects in cities across the country. And every morning, as I left for my hospital shift, I'd see Fletcher and his family perched along the street, watching over their territory with the same vigilance they'd once reserved for enemies. But now, they were guardians rather than judges, protectors rather than prosecutors. The crow wars were over. The crow peace had begun. Yet sometimes, late at night when I returned from work, I'd find gifts on my car windshield. Shiny objects the crows had collected. Bottle caps, coins, interesting pebbles, pieces of broken jewelry. Not tributes or payments, but expressions of partnership. A reminder that intelligence, when channeled constructively, creates communities rather than destroys them. That even the smallest act of cooperation can generate waves of positive change. That sometimes the best way to win a war is to transform your enemies into allies. The crows had taught me that lesson. Now they were teaching it to everyone else. 5 years have passed since the Pemberton brothers first invaded our street. The neighborhood has become a case study in human-wildlife coexistence, attracting researchers, filmmakers, and urban planners from around the world. The crows are local celebrities now. Tour groups visit weekly to observe their problem-solving demonstrations. Children from nearby schools come for educational programs about corvid intelligence and urban ecology. Fletcher has become something of a spokesperson for his species, starring in educational videos and scientific presentations. He's learned to operate touchscreens, solve complex puzzles, and even seems to understand the concept of cameras and performance. But success brought unexpected challenges. The constant attention began stressing the crows. Too many visitors, too much noise, too much disruption of their natural routines. Some family groups started relocating to quieter territories. I realized we'd created another problem in solving the first one. The crows had become too famous for their own good. Working with the Wildlife Center and university researchers, we established guidelines for sustainable crow tourism. Limited visitor numbers, designated observation hours, quiet zones during nesting seasons. The crows adapted quickly to the new system, almost as if they understood the compromise. They'd perform their cognitive demonstrations during designated times, then retreat to protected areas for privacy and natural behavior. But Fletcher had one more surprise for us. During a routine demonstration for a group of animal cognition researchers, he began exhibiting behavior we'd never seen before. He approached the puzzle feeder we'd set up, examined it carefully, then ignored it completely. Instead, he began gathering materials from around the observation area, twigs, bottle caps, bits of wire, and constructing something. At first, we thought he was building a nest out of season, but as the structure took shape, we realized it was something else entirely. He was building his own puzzle, a complex construction that required specific manipulations to access the treats he'd hidden inside. But here's what made it remarkable. He was building it for the other crows to solve. Fletcher had become the first documented case of a crow creating cognitive challenges for its own species. The researchers were stunned. This wasn't just tool use or problem solving, it was teaching, innovation, creative expression. Fletcher had evolved from student to teacher. Other crows began imitating his behavior, designing their own puzzles, creating increasingly complex challenges for their family groups. The behavior spread through the murder like wildfire, with each generation of puzzles becoming more sophisticated. We were witnessing the birth of crow culture, not just learned behaviors passed down through families, but intentional education, creative problem solving, and artistic expression. The documentary follow-up aired 2 years later. The Crow Teachers, Evolution of Urban Wildlife Intelligence. It won 3 Emmy Awards and sparked a revolution in how we think about animal cognition and urban ecology. But for me, the most meaningful moment came during the film's premiere. Crawford was there, now serving as the Wildlife Center's volunteer coordinator. He'd completed formal training in animal behavior and was working towards certification as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist. During the Q&A session after the screening, a young student asked him about his transformation from antagonist to advocate. Crawford looked thoughtful. "I spent my whole life believing that intelligence was about domination," he said, "about using your advantages to control others. The Crows taught me that real intelligence is about cooperation, about solving problems together instead of creating problems for each other." He paused, glancing toward Fletcher, who was perched nearby in his travel carrier. "They didn't just forgive me, they educated me, and now I try to pass that education on to others." After the event, Fletcher approached Crawford's carrier and dropped something through the bars, a small wooden puzzle he'd constructed that afternoon, simple but elegant, requiring 3 specific manipulations to access the treat hidden inside, a gift from teacher to student. Crawford solved it carefully, methodically, then offered the treat back to Fletcher. Fletcher accepted it with what looked remarkably like approval. The parking situation that started this whole saga seems almost trivial now, but it taught me something profound about conflict resolution and community building. Sometimes the biggest bullies just need to be reminded that they're part of something larger than themselves, that their actions affect others. That cooperation produces better outcomes than competition. That intelligence without empathy leads to isolation. The Crows understood this instinctively. They'd lived in communities for millions of years, developing social structures based on mutual support and shared problem-solving. Humans apparently need more practice, but we're learning. The Neighborhood Association now uses principles of corvid cooperation and conflict resolution. When disputes arise, we focus on finding solutions that benefit everyone, rather than determining winners and losers. The parking spaces remain fairly distributed. Neighbors look out for each other. Children play safely in streets that were once territories of intimidation and fear. And every morning, Fletcher and his extended family patrol our block, keeping watch over their human neighbors with the same protective vigilance they show their own young. Not because we've tamed them or trained them, but because we've earned their trust. Because we've proven that humans, despite our flaws, can learn to be better neighbors. The Crow Wars ended not with conquest, but with conversion. Not with victory, but with understanding. Not with enemies defeated, but with allies created. And sometimes, late at night when I return from my hospital shifts, I'll find Fletcher waiting on my car roof, not for food or entertainment, but for conversation. I'll tell him about my day, the patients I've helped, the challenges I've faced, the small victories and defeats that make up a human life. He listens intently, head cocked, occasionally offering soft caws that sound remarkably like encouragement. Then he'll share his own stories in a language I'm still learning to understand. Updates about his family, observations about the neighborhood, plans for tomorrow's puzzle constructions. We sit together in comfortable companionship, a nurse and a crow, 2 species that found common ground in the most unlikely of conflicts. And I realize that the best neighborhoods aren't built on property values or parking regulations or homeowner association bylaws. They're built on relationships, on mutual respect and shared responsibility, on the understanding that we're all in this together, humans and crows, teachers and students, former enemies who became friends. The Pemberton brothers thought they could own our street through intimidation and entitlement. Instead, they taught us how to build a community through cooperation and understanding. The Crows were excellent teachers, but they were even better neighbors. And now, 5 years later, I can't imagine our street without them, without their intelligence and curiosity and complex social structures, without their daily reminders that the best solutions come from working together rather than fighting alone, without their proof that even the most unlikely partnerships can transform enemies into allies. The parking wars are over. The peace is just beginning.